Hello, everyone. I'm going to thank Foreign Object and Sepideh for proposing this idea and sort of asking me to come back. I always have a great time doing these events, and I think it's pretty cool that I'm talking to people from all over the world, which is great. So I'm not going to do anything too complicated today. I'm going to start off by just talking about Kant's philosophy, and then we're gonna, in the second session, we'll kind of talk about Hegel and Hegel's criticism of Kant. But before I talk about Kant in general, I'm just going to give you what I hope is maybe a clear formulation of the problem that both, let's say, Kant and Hegel were trying to address, which goes back to the ancient Greeks. It's a very seminal problem of philosophy. So I'm going to frame it first and then kind of maybe take us through certain solutions to this sort of problem in a way, and then sort of Kant's, as it were, position, and then we'll talk about Kant in a bit more detail. So, so philosophy as a discipline itself, we could say, is restless, if you like, or restless in the sense that philosophy questions everything, right? I mean, if you ever take any kind of philosophy class with anyone at any kind of university or any kind of seminar or group, if it's an introductory course, what they will sort of tell you is that, philosophers have historically just questioned everything. But part of this kind of general description of philosophy as that which is restless or that which questions is that it's not really satisfied with things that are taken for granted. So generally we could describe these as things that are just taken as givens, they're just given to us without any reflective or critical input, or they're assumed to be the case. So philosophy as a discipline historically, at least in the West, hasn't been satisfied with the givenness of its topic, of its subject matter. So for instance, this is different from other disciplines of investigation. So for example, if you're a chemistry professor, or if you're a chemist working in a lab, your discipline or the topic of your discipline is defined. You study chemical substances, you study elements and compounds. There's no need to go back and question what the topic or the subject matter of chemistry is. It's sort of taken for granted that chemistry is the study of chemical substances, for instance. And chemistry can do its work and do its science, as it were, without needing to question its subject matter, or without needing to question the status of its subject matter as something that is given or taken for granted. But the reason philosophy is historically has been, like I said, not satisfied with this is that there's two essential broad elements of other disciplines that take the subject matter for granted. One is that the boundaries or the parameters of their topic is assumed, right? So like chemistry, chemistry assumes that it studies chemical compounds, as it were, for example, and the outline of that subject matter is really well defined. So that's one thing that it assumes. The other thing that it assumes is that it can have access to the subject matter. So in our example, right, chemists, as a discipline, chemistry takes for granted that it can actually access and know and have knowledge of chemical substances. So the inquiry or the investigation of these disciplines that aren't philosophy, right? What they do is they begin from some sort of predetermined or predefined area of study. right? Chemists begin from the assumption that they have access to chemical compounds and that their study is the study of chemical compounds. In a word, they take these things as presuppositions. Now, philosophy, like I said, isn't really satisfied with this, because if we're going to take those two things for granted, namely the boundary of a subject matter and the access to that subject matter, then that means that any result that we may have from that subject matter is going to be predicated on or conditioned by these two assumptions. So again, just in the example, for instance, if you're doing chemistry, so the results in a lab of a chemist is going to be, at least conceptually or logically, conditioned by the parameters of the study in question and the subject matter. But like I said, philosophy historically sits uneasy with this. So there's something different. So this is the point here, is that there's something a little bit different with philosophy as a discipline historically compared to other disciplines or other forms of human knowledge, right? So philosophy has historically called this givenness or these assumptions into question. On the one hand, it's called into question the givenness of its content, so the subject matter that philosophy is supposed to study. And on the other hand, it's called into question the approach or the methodology that philosophy will take in analyzing or investigating its subject matter. So in respect, we cannot take for granted as philosophers or as people who do philosophy, philosophy itself cannot take for granted the subject matter nor the method. And that is because these things, the method or the subject matter, these things are issues that philosophy itself has to establish in its investigation. So one way out of this problem, sorry, just to note, I do have a cat and she does tend to run around my room when I'm talking on Zoom. So you might see my cat in the background. Yeah, there she is. She doesn't care about Hegel. But okay, so what was I saying? Right, so one way that philosophers have tried to avoid this problem of taking things for granted is to say something like, well, what if we just reflect upon that which is immediately given to us? So we're not going to do anything to it, as it were. We're not going to construct a model or an approach or methodology. We're going to just try to take as our topic or as our subject matter that which is given to us through intuition. And by intuition, all I mean is that which is immediately, for lack of a better word, given. That is, rather than say, oh, let's, I don't know, think about the nature of reality by thinking about God and the world, rather than use those concepts, philosophy can just say, we're not going to even talk about the God or the world. We're just going to concern ourselves with that which is immediately accessible and immediately given to us. So what this would mean then is that that which is immediately given through intuition isn't something that we can know by deriving it from something else. And so it can't be conditioned by anything else. In a way, it has to be kind of autonomous or free. So that which is immediately given has to, cannot have any kind of qualification or any kind of characteristic to it. Now, historically, this is what's known in philosophy as the first principle. So a lot of philosophers going back to the ancient Greeks, the pre-Socratics, and all the way up to the modern era with people like Leibniz and Descartes, in some ways Spinoza, but Spinoza is a bit different. Certainly Descartes, all of these philosophers have posited what they call a first principle, or that which can be reflected upon and thought about first. So a first principle, you can, so if you're, I don't know, if you're Aristotle, your first principle is the primary moving substance, for example. If you're Plato, your first principle is the idea of the good. So the idea being that there's a first principle that is sort of established, or that is given to us, as it were. And out of this first principle, philosophers can then deduct and explain the world or what exists, right? So for thousands of years, basically, this was the way philosophy was conducted. What was, you had different philosophers positing different first principles. I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but it's important to keep in mind that this was a very common way of doing philosophy, at least in Europe, was to try to determine a first principle. Now, the problem with this approach is that it assumes that the way to avoid the kind of problem of the givens that we were just talking about is to appeal to a first principle, or appeal to ontology. And by ontology, all I mean is the sort of classical definition of ontology, which is it's a study or a science of being. Being is sort of maybe a very kind of simple term, right? So we have to, if we can understand being or what is in a very kind of simple way, then we can deduce from that further qualifications and further characteristics about the world and have a stronger basis for knowledge. But like I said, this first principle approach is problematic in a way because it's formal, right? So notice how I just said first principle and listed everyone from the pre-Socratics to, say, Leibniz and Descartes, and that's because they all engage in this kind of method of doing philosophy. So in a way, it doesn't matter what the content of the first principle is. All that really matters is that it's first, or that it's a principle that is stipulated first before you deduce everything from it. But there's a problem, which is, well, how do we know which first principle is the true first principle? Because they contradict one another, right? Plato says one thing, Aristotle says something else, Descartes says something else. They all have different first principles. So how can we discern which is the actual first principle? How do we tell them apart? How do we differentiate and determine which one is true, which one gets at the truth, right? So the issue is here, because the approach is formal, it doesn't really tell us anything about the content of the first principle. And don't worry, I'll be getting to Kant very soon, because Kant is going to be trying to intervene in this discourse and kind of critique these ways of doing philosophy, right? So one thing about the first principle approach, again, you can think of Plato or Aristotle or even Descartes in some sense. One thing with their approach, generally speaking, is that in order to determine what comes first ontologically, that is, what comes first as being, we have to sort of know what it is that comes first, right? So, for example, if you're Plato and you're arguing that basically what determines all of reality and all the forms of all the ideas of forms that then ground the world and so on, Plato argues that there's this thing called the good, this idea of the good, which is kind of the overarching foundation to everything, to all of reality. And the problem is, well, how does Plato know that, right? To put it another way, before we can establish a first principle, we have to, it sort of presupposes that we know that this principle has to be the first one, as opposed to the second one or the third one. And so what this means logically, or in a way, is that we have to, in a sense, examine not what is or not what exists, but what determines existence, what determines the first principle to be first. And so in a sense, we are taking for granted yet again that our knowledge or our cognition of the first principle is up to the task to think about the first principle as being first. Now, I'm going to just pause here and point out that, because in case people have, in case any of you have read any of the people I've mentioned, like Plato or Aristotle or Descartes or Leibniz, you'll say, well, wait a minute, these are generalizations. I'm making broad strokes. That's not fair. And that's all true. I am making generalizations and I'm making broad strokes, but for a very good reason. And that is because for Kant, Kant saw all of this as a problem, right? Which was that what he called the dogmatic philosophers, right? They essentially went around conducting their philosophy in this way, using first principles. And they used their first principles to try to describe being or reality without really giving any space to having a theory of knowledge or a theory of cognition. And so, like I said, in order to determine what comes first ontologically as a first principle, that requires that we know or we have a cognition of the first principle as first. This presupposes that we have a theory of knowledge at work or a theory of cognition at work. And the word for a theory of knowledge is what is called epistemology in philosophy, which just means a theory of knowledge. So in a sense, it presupposes a theory of knowing. And so to avoid this problem, so the problem is if we have to have a working theory of knowing before we can have a first principle, then that means that the theory of knowing is actually first. And the first principle is kind of a secondary principle, not really a first principle. You see what I mean? So this means that philosophy as a discipline, and this is where Kant comes in, philosophy as a discipline needs to investigate knowledge or knowing, or the ways in which we know before we can say anything about reality or ontology. And so it demands for a critical philosophy that doesn't really begin with ontology or doesn't begin with first principles, but shifts its focus to investigate, like I said, theories of knowing or knowledge. And it does so in order to then be able to establish that we indeed can have or do have knowledge or knowing that is valid and legitimate to then have a cognition of objective things in the world, as it were. And so this shift from first principles to an investigation of how knowing works or how knowledge works, for then as a way for us to then be able to do metaphysics, as it were, is Kant's great revolution in the history of philosophy. I'm just going to check for time. Okay, it's been about 20 minutes. I've been rambling about knowing, but I hope that sort of makes sense, right? So that that there's this shift, and Kant inaugurated this shift, and it's a very important shift in history of philosophy, and so on and so forth. Okay, I'm going to just pause here for a second because I see there's at least one person has a question. Yes, ask your question. You have to unmute your mic though before you ask.
Yeah. So this reality of nature and the perception of knowledge, it could be deceiving, or it could be very personalized depending on the level of a knowledge a person is containing, depending upon the surroundings or his own limitations. So reality could be deceiving also. For me, for my reality could be very different from your reality or somebody else's reality, depending upon the level of surroundings and atmospheres. So how can we say, how can we be very sure that the reality, what we see or what we are perceiving is a reality, as in a like nature of reality is a questionable thing, you know?
Right. Well, yes. Well, I mean, in a way, this is sort of the problem that Kant is trying to address, right? Which is that we, in order to be able to say anything about reality as an objective reality, right, as a reality that is not a figment of our imagination or not something that we just create in our minds, but to say that it actually exists out there in the world, as it were, that requires us to have or to understand how our capacities to know things, how that works. So Kant's point is we have to have a theory of how cognition operates first, how our minds work essentially, before we can say anything about the world, right? So so never mind whether or not, you know, I mean, so one thing that always comes up in discussions of Kant is that really stupid phrase or thing that people say, you know, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? And both Hegel and Kant have an answer to that. Kant's answer is, well, whenever we have experiences of trees falling in forests, they make a sound. So we can say that they do make a sound insofar as we experience them making a sound, but we can't know whether they make a sound in themselves outside of our experience, right? This is sort of Kant's distinction, which I'll get to, between phenomena and what he calls noumena. Hegel's answer to that is a stupid question. Why are you asking that? And I'll explain what that means when we get to Hegel, but Hegel thinks that's just silly. But we'll see why. But yes, to your question, yes, the Kant's point, right, is that we do have to investigate the ways in which our knowing works, and that so before we can say anything about the world or about reality or about objects or anything like that, we have to, as it were, get clear about what we can actually know and what we can't know, right? And this I mean, if you never read any Kant before, I mean, I just want to emphasize that this was a huge shift in Western philosophical thinking. I mean, universities in Prussia at the time were appointing people to Kantian chairs of philosophy. Like, they were naming chairs of philosophy after Kant while Kant was still alive. Like, it was a big deal when he sort of published this book, because up until that point, right, and that's what I tried to outline, up until that point in European philosophy, at least, philosophers, for the most part, relied on the kind of first principle approach, which was to say, you know, we'll do ontology first, and then we can just describe the world. And Kant's intervention was to say, well, no, we can't do that for a lot of reasons. We have to first have a proper theory of knowledge, because how do you know that the principle you're using is actually working or is actually accurate or reflective of the reality in question?
It was a very big discussion about, say, there's like they were giving the example, say, like, there is a star which is say, like, 450 billion light years away from our reach, and today epistemologically we don't know that that star exists, but say, like, after 100 years that light will come to us and we will get to know that that star is existing. So star was always existing there in its own place. It's just that we were not aware of the reality that of its existence. So it's very questionable that how much limitation is your epistemology is also very limited, you know. So we can't always say that this is the we have all the knowledge and now we can't question anything other than the real world around us is in our academically we can prove everything, and we can't question anything. So this is the only reality in the brackets.
Right. Well, I mean, the stars thing, I mean, Kant would say something like, look, there's no, I mean, prior to us, so for example, prior to us discovering the existence of some star, we did not have a knowledge of it, right? But once we do discover it, and once we do have a knowledge of it, then we know of it. We have an experience of it, right? And so Kant's, and I'll get back to Kant a little bit, and then we can do more of a question and answer. But because I don't want to take, because I still have some points to make here. But the idea being that so the reason people hate Kant in a way is because he does make this distinction, right, between things that we can know and the way he goes around arguing this. I mean, the Critique of Pure Reason is like 700 pages. I'm not going to try to summarize it, but basically the way he argues for this is that any kind of finite rational being like human beings, we have certain concepts and categories that are in place that are prior to any experience we have of any objects. And these categories are in a way necessary for us to have experience at all. So in contrast to Hume, right? Hume famously argued that the way we form knowledge is we have experiences, and over time these experiences build up and we build up habits. So for Hume, we have, he called it a kind of a bundle theory of knowledge, in that you build up experiences of, say, things falling down when you drop them, right? And that informs your kind of theory of that experience for Hume. And for Kant, he wants to argue something differently, which is that, well, no, for Kant, the categories that he says we have work in tandem with the, with, as it were, the sense data we get from experiences, and the two sort of, I'm paraphrasing like 50 pages of Kant, so bear with me. The two sort of work together, he says, and he gives arguments for how that is, to make the conditions of experience to be possible. And the word he uses for this entire sort of enterprise, for his theory of knowledge, is his famous word, which is the transcendental, right? He says we have these categories in place in our minds which are transcendental. And what it means by this, and I'll get back to my thing in a second here. So the transcendental has been sort of defined in different ways, but they're not quite, none of them quite capture what Kant himself meant by the term. So one of the general ways that people use the word transcendental is to say it just means the investigation into the conditions necessary for the possibility of something, right? So that which is transcendental are conditions needed for something to be possible. Or for example, the conditions needed for knowledge to be possible. But if that's how we want to define the transcendental, it's not really unique to Kant, right? He didn't just invent this, because the ancient Greeks were doing this, right? So the pre-Socratics were doing this, Aristotle was doing this. So if we just define the transcendental as kind of an examination to the conditions of that which is necessary for something to be possible, that's not exactly what Kant means by the term. So we might say, okay, well, what if the transcendental for Kant, and people have said this before, or they think this is what Kant means, what if it's this supplanting of ontology as first philosophy with epistemology? Okay, yes, because I just said Kant sort of does this in philosophy, or he does this in a more stronger way. But he wasn't the first person to really do this, because Descartes, in a way, also supplants ontology with epistemology. So if the transcendental is just that, then that's not really new to Kant or innovative of Kant. And this is again, it's a bit of a broad definition of the transcendental, but transcendental philosophy for Kant, what it does involve is a shift or a move, if you like. So it involves a shift from a direct reference to objectivity or the objective world to an investigation of the conditions for the reference to objectivity, right? So I'll say that again. For Kant, the transcendental approach involves a shift or a move, if you like, or a modification. And it's a shift from having, say, direct access or direct reference to the objective external world, as it were, to focusing more on an investigation of the various conditions for this reference to even be possible, right? Or if you like, it's a move from an appeal to the privileged status of givens, that is, given content or given approach of philosophy, to a privileged determiner, if you want to phrase it this way. And this word or this phrase, privileged determiner, is something that Richard Winfield uses, for example, when he's talking about Kant. So I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit about Kant's Phenomena-Noumena, and then maybe we can pause and have some more discussion. So I'm going to talk about this shift, right? Because what's important here is that only in the manner in which an investigation of knowing or of knowledge, only an inquiry into how knowledge works could then shed light on the validity of our cognition or our knowledge itself, and how this knowledge determines or conditions the objects of knowledge, right? So for instance, if we want to have knowledge of, I don't know, chairs or something, whatever it is, any kind of experience we have, if we first investigate how our knowledge works, as it were, then that will eventually lead us to have a proper validity and a proper understanding of the object of knowledge, or the objects themselves, if you want. And that is because it is only in knowing it. So it is only if we only know the conditions that sort of determine the objects, that makes the knowing of the objects themselves valid, let's say. So by focusing on knowledge, or the ways of knowing, if you want to call it that, so what Kant does is he wants to focus on epistemology, focus on knowledge, without claiming, and this is the important part, right? Without claiming that this knowledge has direct access to objects in themselves, or to objects apart from our knowing experience of them, right? So what he calls phenomena, or appearances, are objects that are given to us in our experience, and that we can know them through our experience, through the fusion of the categories of our understanding, as he calls them, and the sensible experience of our intuition of the objects, right? So we can know something, which is we can know the phenomena, the appearances of things. And so if the structure of cognition for Kant, if the form of cognition, or if the form of the categories actually does determine and condition the character of its object, then philosophy can properly critique knowing, or it can probably investigate the kind of mechanics of this knowing to see if its knowledge, or if the claims to knowledge hold up, as it were, or if they have any kind of objectivity. So in this sense, when Kant is privileging epistemology, what he's really privileging is a knowing of knowing, or a knowledge of knowledge, or a knowledge of how knowledge works, if you like. So what is knowable in Kant's view must be, and I mean, I'm trying to summarize the first critique, and I'm trying not to use a lot of jargon, but trust me, Kant uses a lot of jargon and hundreds of pages to make these arguments. So for Kant, something is only knowable, right, in that it is conditioned by the knowing cognition. And so what this necessarily does is that it puts limitations to what we can know. And it puts limitations to what can be theoretically and philosophically claimed to be known. Because anything that is known has to be conditioned by the knowing subject or the knowing cognition. And so in this sense, what is known is relative to the conditions of knowing. And so immediately, and so Kant says this in the introduction to the critique, the first critique, this immediately excludes that which is unconditioned, which is God, freedom, and the immortality of the soul, for instance. Because if God is conditioned, then God is no longer absolute supreme being of the world. God becomes a relative being, but that is self-contradictory. Freedom, if freedom means autonomy, freedom is also excluded from theoretical knowledge, because all knowledge, or all knowable knowledge for Kant, or all philosophical knowable knowledge, is systematically conditioned by the categories of, as he says, the categories of the understanding. So that excludes freedom, although he does write a second book called Critique of Practical Reason, in which he does kind of try to argue for the practical need for freedom and so on. So it gets complicated in Kant's philosophy. We're not going to talk about that today, but I'm just giving you the example of what is sort of excluded from the limitations that Kant puts on what can be known. So one thing to point out immediately in all of this, right, is that what we know is what we have experience of, or what we can experience. So Kant calls this the phenomena, and all phenomena means is just kind of the appearances. And so, for example, you know, so we can know everything that we can experience, and that means everything we can see and touch and hear. And they all kind of correspond to our categories, as it were. But of course, there's a bit of a problem, which is that phenomena are phenomena of something, right? And remember, Kant says and repeats this, that the claims to knowledge that we make isn't a direct access to the objects as they might be in themselves. And what he means by things in themselves is entities or objects, as it were, outside of our experience or removed from our experience. So he draws a sharp line of divide here, Kant, in his philosophy. He says, well, look, we can know phenomena, and as long as we can experience them, we have a knowledge of them. But everything that we do not experience, or everything that may fall beyond the bounds of our experience, we cannot know. So things as they are in themselves, or what he calls the noumena, are things that are not giving to us in our experience, right? So for example, God, however you want to define God, because of the way Hegel presents his arguments, right? Logically, God cannot be theoretically known the way we can know people and chairs and objects and animals, because that would then theoretically subordinate God to a position of relativity, right, relative to the conditions of knowing. So you make God relative, but then that just negates God. God cannot be relative to anything. So we can't really know God in the way we can know objects, or objects in our experience. But also we cannot know how those objects might be in themselves, right? So the reason everyone hates Kant is because he draws this sharp divide, and he does what is sort of like a very fine balancing act. Have you ever seen people walk on rope high in the buildings, right? They have to balance themselves. So Kant tries to have this balance between things that we can know in our experience, and he calls them phenomena. And there are phenomena because they are appearances or phenomena of something, and the things that they're appearances of might have some sort of existence or subsistence outside of our experience, but we cannot have any knowledge of how objects behave or what kind of qualities they may have and so on outside of our experience, right? So for example, so to go back to that example of the tree falling in the forest, right? Kant's answer would be to say, well, look, like I said before, when we hear trees falling, right? We have an experience of things falling. You know, you walk in the forest, a tree or branch falls, you know what that sounds like. And so that means for Kant that because we have that experience, we can kind of deduce that, yes, when trees falls in the forest, they make sounds. But then you ask Kant, well, wait a minute, what if no one is around to hear the tree? Does it still make a sound? And that's where Kant sort of gets a little bit iffy on the issue, because he says, well, why would you ask that question? We know that trees make sounds when we have experiences of them. So to try to determine whether or not they make a sound outside of our experience of them making sounds, it's kind of pointless for Kant. So the question is a bit moot for Kant, right? His answer is, well, look, you have experiences of things falling all the time. They make a sound or a noise. We even hear trees falling and they make a sound or a noise. So basically, be happy with the fact that you have that experience and we have the knowledge of the thing falling, as it were. But like I said, because Kant makes this division or this divide between things in themselves and things that we can know, the phenomena, he doesn't really describe how they relate or how if there's any kind of relationship between them, right? What he does say about the noumena, and this is important to keep in mind, is he says, look, we can't know the noumena, or we can't really have any knowledge of the thing in itself, but, and this is an important but we can conceptually think about the thing in itself. Now, this is an important distinction, right? So he makes a distinction between thinking and knowing, and they're not the same thing, right? So to know something is to have the thought that you're having validated or confirmed, right? So so just a stupid example, I don't ask me why, but for example, if you're reading Don Quixote and you finish reading the novel and you say, I know this book, I have an understanding of this book, right? Your claim, your sentence is based upon something. It's based upon an experience you've had of reading the novel, right? It would be ludicrous to say, I know Don Quixote the novel without ever having read the novel, right? So knowledge, claims of knowledge are based upon or are grounded in experiences for Kant, right? Whereas thought, not necessarily. So conceptually, we can sort of speculatively think about the thing in itself without grounding it in any experience. We can abstractly reflect on it as an interesting concept. And so that will so that's what he does, right? He says, well, look, philosophically, we can speculate about the thing in itself and we can think about it abstractly, but we can never have any experience of it, right? Because the because the instance you have an experience of something, it stops being a thing in itself, and it becomes a thing for you, a thing for consciousness, a thing for, it becomes an object of your experience. And so it's conditioned by all the categories that Kant argues for. So this is an interesting point to keep in mind. And Kant sort of leaves it there, as it were, in the first critique. He says, well, yeah, okay, I've told you what our limitations are to what we can know and what we cannot know. And great, now we know what we can know and we can do metaphysics. That's sort of Kant's view. And what's annoying about this is that it seems to a lot of critiques and critics of Kant, it seems to a lot of people that Kant divides up the world, right? Kant, in a way, ontologically divides reality into things we can know and things we cannot know, and doesn't say anything really about the things in themselves, and just sort of leaves this balance, or it's not even really a dualism, but he leaves this bifurcated world in place. And then immediately people start criticizing him for it, even while he was still alive. Actually, people saying, "What are you doing? You can't, you can't just section reality like that. You have, philosophically, we have to be able to think about all of reality, not just what we can have experiences of." And I mean, it wasn't just people in Kant's time. I mean, ever since Kant's first critique, philosophy, even today, either philosophers are critics of Kant's position, they reject it, they try to criticize it, they refuse it, or they sort of accept it in some weird way. For example, Heidegger, just an example, Heidegger is a Kantian, except Heidegger does, in a way, accept or acknowledge some variation of Kant's own project, for instance. So depending on what you think about Kant, you either kind of accept his general system or the general thrust of his philosophy, or you want to reject it and criticize it. But like I said, so this division between the thing in itself and the phenomena has been criticized endlessly for many different reasons. So I'm going to end it there. And I'm happy to have a discussion, or if you have any questions, we can do that. That's really all I really want to say, was just a basic sort of summary of Kant's distinction. But okay, there seems to be some comments in the chat.
Hi, thank you for the lecture, first of all. I guess I want to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more on the sort of what is the sort of cutting edge new thing that the transcendental introduces, or what a transcendental in Kant introduces, because this sort of differentiation from the ancient Greeks into I guess sort of Enlightenment rationalists like Descartes. Yeah, I don't think that completely clicked for me, the sort of differentiation from what is different about sort of the transcendental that isn't this sort of highlighting of conditions of possibility or experience, or the highlighting of a shift from ontology to epistemology. Is it a mixing of these two sort of shifts, or is it this noumenal divide of not having access to the in itself? Yeah, I guess sort of I want to hear a little bit more about what your thoughts are on what is sort of the key crucial thing that differentiates the transcendental from what came previously.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, one of the difficulties is that Kant himself gives different definitions of the term in his system. So one of the problems is that the ways in which we so people who try to read Kant have to kind of try to square that circle, as it were, which is a problem. But generally, and so this is, I think this is what I mentioned. Generally, the transcendental. So, for example, so one thing Kant does argue, right, is that so these conditions that I kept saying, conditions for experience and so on. For Kant, these conditions involve space, time, and what he calls the 12 categories of the understanding, which are 12 concepts that Kant tries to argue that any finite rational being, including all of us, all human beings, that we're sort of hardwired with it, right? So we're not in a way born tabula rasa without any kind of blank. So like for Hume, for example, he would say something like, human beings are blank slates, and then you have a bunch of experiences of things, and it's only through experiences that you form concepts. So Hume would argue, well, look, you have experience of gravity, you have, things fall down, and eventually your mind forms a concept of things falling down, and then you can grasp it. Kant is arguing the reverse in a way. He's saying that there's some fundamental concepts that are necessary for us to even be able to have an experience at all. And the name for these, what he calls these categories and time and space, these are transcendental categories, right? So in a way, they are, they function as conditions necessary for, let's say, the possibility of experience. That's kind of the textbook definition that people will give of what Kant means by the transcendental. It's not entirely inaccurate, but it's not entirely accurate either. So I think what I said was, it's a bit more accurate to define the transcendental as marking a shift, right? And that shift is a shift from having direct access to the objective world, right? So it's a shift away from that, having direct access, or rather direct reference. Maybe that's a better way to put it. A shift away from direct reference to objectivity, and a shift towards an investigation, like a philosophical investigation of the different conditions that are required for this reference to be possible in the first place, right? So so that's the shift that I was trying to highlight. So for instance, just to go back to the Hume example, so in Hume's mind, the way we have a concept of time or of space is we have to have enough experiences, right? So Hume would say, you have an experience of a chair, then you close your eyes and then you open your eyes and the chair has moved because someone's bumped into it. So your mind, in a way, identifies the difference. And then you have more experience and more experience. And then eventually you have an experience of spatialization. And Kant's criticism is that, well, that's a ridiculous way of thinking about time or space. And Kant says, well, just try to think of any object in isolation outside of space or time. And we can't. If you all close your eyes and think about an empty white room and a black box in the middle of the white room, and you say, oh, there's no space. Well, that's not true, because we can differentiate between the black box in our imagination and the white background of the space. It presupposes the notion of space, right? So this is all to say that space and time in the 12 categories for Kant are transcendental. And what that means is that they must be there before experience is even possible. So they're prior to experience. So the opposite of Hume, or the opposite of the empiricists, they come before experience and they condition experience. So this is why he calls them a priori, which is just a bit of Latin, which just means, you know, prior to experience. So that's sort of the point about the transcendental, is that they serve a conditioning function, and the transcendental conditions are all a priori. So we're sort of hardwired with it, if you like. We're born with the transcendental conditions, if you want to think about it that way. Okay, we have another question from Renzo, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much, Borna. Thank you very much for the questions. Very interesting to think in many aspects. And one thing that made me think recursively is the transcendental in the unknown. In which sense? I must tell you in which sense that now, but I was writing in the chat. Because we transcended with the now in two ways. Is the unknown, no, is the now and now. I'm interested in the second one because in my research I'm working with Latin American localities of Andean people in the experience with the geographical aspect, understand the animals, speaking in this sense. The no and now for me is that we don't know, but we are going to know in the future between technical medias or between I don't know, the new scientific research that is going to know something. But we know that we are going to know something in the future, in this sense. We have this certainty. But there is another aspect, that is the now and now. In which sense the transcendental is constructed in this second one, the now and now. How do you see this? Because in the animals, they believe in the spirits of the mountains, they believe in the spirits of the rivers, they connect in some other experience that we Occidentals connected with this, with kind of logical knowledge that we have in other different aspects of these people, of these cultures. How do you relate in this experience, this transcendence, in this and now for you? If I may do the questions. Thank you very much, Ariel.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I got the core of your question there. Did you write it in the chat, you said, or?
Yeah, but not all, because as I told you, you say the knowledge is always by the experience. But there is knowledge like something that we don't know, but we are going to know. But at the same time, there is knowledge for me that we're never going to know. And this is something that is not connected with the rational, but more with the intuition, as you say in the beginning, the intuition here that is more connected with the symbolical aspects. No? In this sense, taken with this experience to animist people or another culture that is more, the transcendence is not going by the rational, it's transcended by the experience, by sense, not by the cognitive. How do you observe this in this transcendence that you speak with us? I don't know if more clear now.
Well, okay. So if I understand your question, you're asking me about experiences that aren't, let's say, rational or aren't subordinate to, let's say, rational philosophical knowing or comprehension. Well, sure, yes. I mean, look, human beings, we have all sorts of experiences that aren't really explainable, but I mean, in a way, Kant is not really interested in that, because the at least in the European tradition, right? Historically, European philosophy has always been interested in the truth, capital T truth, or that which is absolute. And by absolute, I just mean that which is not relative to anything, or not contingent, or can we know something absolutely to be true? And it's been 4,000 years of philosophers arguing with each other over how and what that is, and they have had different mixed results. And so Kant's intervention is to say, well, the problem is that the approach is wrong, right? So because I mean, think about it this way. You know, we could all still be followers of Socrates, you know, ancient Greek Socrates, who famously kept arguing that he doesn't know anything, right? Socrates, I mean, if you go back and you read any of Plato's dialogues with Socrates, Socrates is continuously saying, oh, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. It's the other person that says, oh, I know what justice is. I know what goodness is. I know what beauty is, and so on. And all Socrates does is ask him questions. Oh, how do you know that? How do you define that? Is this the case? Is that the case? So Socrates doesn't make any claims to knowledge, really. In any way, he sort of thinks that's not impossible, but there's a certain skepticism involved. But either the choices are, you know, that kind of skepticism where we can't really know anything about the world or anything like this, which is kind of depressing, or we can actually say something substantial about the world and about reality. But like I tried to present in the thing, this kind of presupposes that we have a working theory of how knowledge works. So if we have experiences that are outside of rational comprehension, for someone like Kant, that's a waste of time. Like philosophy has better things to do than to try to understand non-rational experiences, or rather, any kind of experiences can be rationally explained for Kant, let's say, something like this. So he is, in a sense, a bit of a rationalist. But if you don't like that, then Kant's not going to be great for you then. So it depends. Okay, we have more questions. So I'll go to 𝐁𝐿𝐤. 𝐁𝐿𝐤? Sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you for the really interesting talk. So my question is, so I understand the criticism of starting from ontological first principles due to the fact that, you know, such principles presuppose a theory of knowing or a certain kind of epistemology. But doesn't epistemology also presuppose at least a minimal kind of ontology, to the extent that we would have to have objects which are, you know, appropriately correspond to our theories of knowledge. So it seems like both ontology and epistemology sort of mutually presuppose one another to a certain extent. So it seems like to me it would be problematic to try to step into this sort of mutually entailing circle to in order to ground all philosophical or all subsequent philosophical thinking. And so it seems like starting from one side or the other seems like to some extent contingent and you know, perhaps practical and not necessarily you know, philosophically self-grounding. If that hopefully that made any sense.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes, sure. It's I mean, one thing I will say is that I mean, Kant tries to be careful here. So how he defines the transcendental is, like I was saying a moment ago, these are, let's say, conditions or things,
mañana, bueno, hola,
or
¿cómo
things
estás? Sabes que
required.
tengo la cabeza
I'm gonna meet this person. Sorry. So Kant's transcendental philosophy looks for the conditions required for experience to be possible, right? So what that means is that it's not necessarily assuming the existence of objects, right? It's just sort of saying, well, if experience were even to be had, what are the conditions required for experience to be possible, right? So the point being, the entire thing rests on the word possibility, right? So if we are the kind of beings that do have experience of objects, right, those experiences would be possible only if we have these conditions in place, as it were. So once these conditions are in place, we can have experience of objects. But yeah, you're right. This just kind of presupposes certain, I mean, you could say, look, this presupposes that we have not knowledge of the conditions, but that we can kind of think about the conditions. And Kant himself spends several hundred pages, which I won't try to summarize here, to try to show you why these conditions are these conditions and how he goes about trying to prove them. So he tries to do it systematically. Now, I mean, we'll get to Hegel soon, but one of Hegel's complaints to Kant is, why those 12 categories? Where do they come from? How did you prove them? And because if you read the first critique, Hegel just has 12 logical concepts that he says are, the 12 categories. And the kind of modified categories from Aristotle, as it were. And Hegel's complaint is, well, you didn't prove them. You just borrowed them from Aristotle's system, right? So to your question, and it's a good question, to your question, yes, I think you're right. Kant does run into some problems because he doesn't do enough, and Hegel would agree with you that Kant doesn't do enough to properly justify the transcendental conditions that he presents. I mean, if I were teaching Kant's first critique, we would go into the details and so on, but this is just a quick seminar. But yes, that was a good question. Okay, we're going to move on to another question by, and sorry if I'm going to mispronounce your name, but Miodrag, is that right? Or Miodrag?
Sort of. It's okay. I wanted to ask, I wanted to start from Descartes and to move on to Kant later, but in Descartes we already have some kind of subject-centered epistemology, if not a subject-centered ontology or worldview in general, because I don't think his epistemological starting point from the subject necessarily commits him to any kind of idealism where subject will be the center of the world, but that isn't even the most relevant thing there, because in epistemology, Descartes already noticed that objects must conform to the subject in some way, or must meet the subject in order for knowledge to occur, right? So starting from that, what type of thing did Kant introduce that is new into epistemology in his Copernican turn, so-called Copernican turn, that we can call his innovation in regard to Descartes? So where did he go a step further from Descartes? Or maybe he was more radical in some sense from Descartes than Descartes, right?
Right. Yeah. Well. I mean, Descartes, as you probably know, engages in his method of doubt, right? And doubts everything except for the fact that he's doubting, right? And so I think therefore I am, and so on. But but in a way, I mean, for Kant, this doesn't go far enough, right? So Descartes' system doesn't really demonstrate how knowledge of our experiences is possible, in the sense that he doesn't ground Descartes' epistemology isn't detailed enough for Kant. I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing, and so what Kant tries to do, and what he tries to show, is that there are in fact certain categories of the mind that are required, like I said, that are sort of in us prior to any experience, that conditions and determine our experiences. If those categories or if those conditions weren't there within us, we would not be able to have an experience of any kind, right? So yes, so there's a similarity, right? Because yes, Descartes has a reflective turn, and in the sense that he does center on the subject's capacity to doubt, but in a way that's not systematic enough. It's not robust enough. And of course, Descartes then ends up producing the dual substance problem, right? Mind and matter are two different substances, and Descartes isn't able to sufficiently explain how they interact. So in a way, Kant tries to avoid that problem by linking the kind of transcendental conditions, like I was saying, to the possibility of experience in general, such that mind and matter, if you want to think of it that way, interact all the time, right? I mean, that would be my off the cuff answer. It might not be satisfying, but that's sort of it. But okay, we're going to go to Chetan, and I do notice that there's comments in the chat, so I'll maybe shift to the chat before we run out of time.
Sorry,
yeah,
Borna.
go ahead. Yes.
Excuse me. Are we done with the part with Kant?
Yes, I mean, this is just question and answering for the Kant section.
Okay, I'm just wondering if it will take too
No,
much
it's
time,
fine. It's okay.
It's fine?
Yeah.
All right.
It should be all right.
Yeah. Do I go ahead?
Yes.
I'm audible? Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for a wonderful talk. I was just wondering, and I think this question came up a couple of times, and I wanted to sort of get what you think about this problem. In what ways Kant's transcendental is different from Platonic forms? And to my reading, I think this emerges again and again when there is one way to think of transcendental as something which exists behind the appearance, like Platonic forms exist in that sense, and we need to go past the illusion to reach to the truth in that. But so at least to my mind, Kant wasn't doing that what Plato was doing in Platonic forms in that sense. So for Kant, there was something within the appearance itself which was important. Which is why I think when we raise the question of ontology and epistemology, I don't think the answer of ontology is an epistemology. That immediate switch. Okay, if ontology is wrong, let's move to epistemology. There we can have a. I think Kant closed that door for us in some senses. He didn't allow that switch to that game to be played anymore. And of course, with Hegel, it finds its own resolution in some senses with negativity and so on and so forth. But how do we think through this distinction between Platonic forms of Plato, which exists behind the appearance and Kant's transcendental, which are questions of conditions for the appearance to emerge? Is there some difference there which has to be marked very clearly, or is it simply an extension of one to the other? And if it is an extension, then how do we think through that? And if there is a sharp break there, if Kant is sharp break from Platonic thought in that sense, then you have something to say upon that, and how do we think through it? Yeah. Thank you.
Right. No, thanks. Well, I mean, Plato's forms. So the immediate difference that I can maybe think of is that Plato's realm of forms, as he calls them, are kind of otherworldly, right? They're in a way beyond or transcendent to the finite world of our sensible objects, right? So that's an important distinction. So Kant doesn't say that. Kant doesn't say that the thing in itself is kind of a heavenly realm of forms or anything. But like I said, because Kant doesn't say much about the thing in itself, because again, we can't know it. So again, I mean, it's like a black hole. It's a mystery, right? So yes, it's the appearances are appearances of objects as they, let's say, exist outside of our experience of them, right? That's what he says. But what this realm of things in themselves, what it looks like, where is it? Like, is it like below the object? Is it within the object? Is it the object's essence? He doesn't say anything because he puts these limitations, right? Whereas Plato says quite a lot about the forms and how they function, how they relate. But yes, I mean, of course, Kant knew Plato very well, and he's aware of the history of philosophy. So there is a similar. I mean, they're both trying to address a similar problem, right? Which is how do we guarantee knowledge, or how do we guarantee that philosophy can secure any kind of claims that aren't just claims of opinion? And philosophers hate opinion because it's just opinions. Everyone has an opinion. It doesn't mean that you're getting at truth, as it were, right? So they try to address the same problem, as it were, from different perspectives. But yeah, but I mean, the thing in itself, or the realm of things in themselves, at least for Kant, we can't say anything. We can't make any qualifications about it. You know what I mean? You can't say if it's a, you know, because the minute we do, we're treating it as an object of our experience, which which Kant rules out, right? Again, this is why everyone hates this distinction, because Kant just leaves it at the distinction and walks away, so to speak. Okay, I think we have a question here.
Thank you.
From,
thank you.
Minhazul. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing people's names. I
No,
apologize.
it's okay. It's okay, no problem. You guys are discussing about Kant, especially. That was a very much enjoyable discussion, and I enjoyed it really much. Especially discussion about Kant welcomes us too much questions. Basically, we do not have enough time to make lots of questions, and we know that we will not even have the answer to have all the questions. But I just want to put forward two questions. Basically, the source of knowledge. I mean, the things you discussed earlier as the first principle to know the reality. We know that very much, that the ancient Greek very much discussed about the reality, especially the pre-Socratic period. We know the philosophers of Iliad, they talked about so much reality. They tried to understand the reality. Some of them knew that they could not approach the reality because reality is very much relative. They knew. Some of them told that reality does not exist at all, or the thing we know that cannot be a standard of reality. So that is a classical debate from we can say that Iliad, school of Iliad to enlightenment. But the thing is that you told that the shifting of the focus. What was the focus exactly? And actually, the focus was Descartes, Leibniz, and the classical debate between the philosophers that what is the beginning or the first cause or the principal cause of the reality. Sooner or later, we can find that some philosophers argued that the reality is God, then the cause of the reality is blah, 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 something like that. Empiricists have argued there in that way. But I think the thing is, Kant is actually telling us that we have to primarily know the system or the condition or the way how we perceive things before we attribute or before we ascribe to the primary cause. But to me, the theory of knowledge or the source of knowledge, that how we perceive, that had begun from the Greek period. I just want to say that the debate began very much earlier. Kant has added something like that, and the primary question and the primary criticism of Kant that we always make to the in respect of Descartes, the certainty or the guarantee of the knowledge. Anything you say, anything you argue, anything you make logical, or anything you want to put forward as an argument about anything, we want to know, or the philosophers want to know the certainty. Like Hegel strictly criticized Kant for the guarantee, how he could know that the 12 categorical imperative exists and how it becomes a priori, how we experience things through that 12 categories and how we can rationalize these things. That is a certainty, and that was a question of Cartesian philosophy, that Descartes was trying to say that we know things, we know through minds, we know perception, these are good, these are bad, but the guarantee Descartes put on, the guarantee was God himself. So basically in Kant is not clearing the certainty, and maybe he is trying to prove the limitation of human knowledge through ascribing a word like noumena, from my point of view. So my question is, how do you think that he is, I mean, he is trying to ascribe the word noumena, but what is actually noumena is we don't know. But we know that there's something maybe noumena, as like according to Kant, but we know what is noumena. So basically what we don't know, how can we know that there might be something like this? So there is a question of certainty, there is a question of guarantee. So how do we maintain the guarantee, or how do we set the guarantee? what is the guarantee? What is the condition of the existence of noumena? If there is a noumena, then we cannot know that. If we don't know that through the categorical imperative, through the experience, how do we know that there might be a noumena? What is the cause of might be thing? That is my question. I believe that I have not cleared my way, but just trying to put forward my question regarding Kant. And exactly one thing that the criticism of Kant, what Hegel put forward, to some extent I agree with him that what is the certainty of these 12 categorical imperatives? These things seemed very much logical to us, that we have a transcendental power, we have the categorical imperative, and that is very much a priori. That is a priori of our borning, our human behavior, and all other things. But what is the certainty? That's the thing of certainty.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a good question, but I think we have to be careful, right? Because Kant says, he argues that we cannot know the noumena or the thing in itself, right? Again, in the same way that we can have knowledge of objects in our experience. However, we can think it, right? And so what I was saying earlier about the distinction between knowledge and thought in Kant is important, or the distinction between cognition, if you like, and thought is important. So Kant agrees with you. We can't know the thing in itself, but that doesn't mean that we can't think about it as a concept, right? So I mean, someone in the chat earlier described it as like a negative, and said that it's a regulative concept, right? So the noumena is and this is true for Kant. The noumena serves as a regulative concept. By regulative, Kant just means that it coordinates, or it helps make sense of the knowledge that we do have. So it plays a negative role in that way, because the noumena itself isn't something that we can positively know, but it's in a way a required concept for us to speculate about and think about, because it in a way sets up what we can know, namely objects of our experiences that are appearances, right? And so it's yes, someone has said in the chat here that the noumena or the thing in itself is basically guarantees the stability and the identity of things, and that's true. Now, like it, and I mean, I'm aware of the time, so we have to kind of wrap up the discussion on Kant in a few minutes. But one thing to point out is that, again, people were no one's satisfied with Kant's position, which is that he just wants to leave things like this, right? We can know phenomena, we cannot know the noumena, although the noumena serves a function in systematic theoretical philosophy. We can't know anything about it, but we have to we have to let me put it this way. He doesn't just invent the noumena out of thin air, right? He tries to deductively demonstrate why something like a thing in itself is logically necessary when we're thinking about knowledge and things that we can know, right? Because another way to define the thing in itself is to define it as that which is unconditioned, right? So the noumena is that which is unconditioned. And if knowledge is conditioned by our categories and by our transcendental conditioning concepts that we have, then by definition, that which is unconditioned cannot be conditioned by us. You see what I mean? So that's another reason why the noumena isn't something that we can know. Again, I appreciate that it's a strange, frustrating thing. But again, like I said, people criticize Kant for this immediately. Okay, we're going to take one more question, and then I think we can take a quick break. So we're going to go to Mafe. Mafe?
Yes, I have a very quick and straightforward question, like about the soul, the concept of soul. Like, I mean, all that you have been explaining explains a lot about the concept of soul, but who after Kant do you think start to try to solve the idea of define what is soul again?
That's a very, I mean, that's a quick question, but it's a very complicated, dense question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, it's for instance, Hegel has a theory of soul, which is a bit different from his theory of subjectivity. And so in a sense, Hegel says something like, the soul is closer to like the essence of a subject, if you like. But I mean, a lot of people have theorized about the soul after Kant in different ways, but it really depends what you mean by that term, and people have tried to define it differently. I won't be able to get into it now because we're running out of time, but yes, I mean, Kant thinks, so for Kant, for example, there's no way that we can know the immortality of the soul in the same way that we can know objects of our experience. So we relegated that to the noumena, to the thing in itself section. I realized people had more comments and questions in the chat, but in the interest of time, and maybe Sepideh agrees with this, maybe we can take 5 minutes, because the Hegel stuff will be less, strangely enough. I'm not going to talk too much about Hegel. I'll just kind of outline his main argument, so it won't take too much time. So maybe we could take about 10 minutes. Is that okay? 10-minute break. So 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and start talking about Hegel. So thank you very much. See you in 10 minutes.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm going to shift gears now and talk about the real, my favorite philosopher, for a lot of reasons. But so I hope what's clear now, in some senses, that Kant makes this famous distinction right before between phenomena and noumena and so on. And like I said, he leaves it sort of in a way unresolved, not unresolved, but it kind of leaves it there, as it were. The German thinkers that immediately came after Kant were both inspired and also, in a sense, critical of Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena. They weren't, satisfied with it. The most famous being Fichte, Schelling, and of course Hegel. And so I'm just going to talk about Hegel and Hegel's sort of criticism of this. And we'll see whether or not we find Hegel's criticism convincing, or whether it makes sense, and to what extent Hegel might be trying to say about the world and about our knowledge of the world and so on. So the first thing to note, right, is that appearances or phenomena are, of course, appearances of something, right? It doesn't make sense to identify something as an appearance without qualifying what that is an appearance of. So what this sort of logically entails, right, is that appearances or phenomena are, in a sense, governed by or determined by their essence or their essential core or their inner essential identity. Now, both Kant and Hegel were aware of this, of course, and that is that in the history of Western or European philosophy, the distinction between essences and appearances is a very famous and old metaphysical distinction, right? The point being that, whatever the essence of something is, it's the substantial, important identity of that thing. And the appearance of that thing is malleable, it changes over time, it's not fixed in any sense, it doesn't determine the identity of the thing or of the object, right? So this distinction between essence and appearance is, again, it's a classical distinction in metaphysics. But really, when we say that we have appearances. They're appearances of something that is essential, right? Because, I mean, just to think of examples of things in our experiences, you know, even the appearances of identical objects have variations to them. So, for example, just take a stupid example, Granny Smith apples, like the green apples that you can buy and eat and so on. Biologically, they're the same thing, right? They're just the same kind of apple, but conceptually, you know, you could use this distinction between essence and appearance to talk about the apples individually and say, well, no two Granny Smith apples are entirely identical because their appearances differ. So some might have different marks on them, some might have a different texture or taste, different sizes of Granny Smith apples and so on. So the point being that the object as it appears to us, there's variation involved, but what remains stable is the essence or the core, no pun intended, but the core of the inner identity of the apple, as it were. So this is important to mention because Hegel's criticism of Kant and Hegel's criticism of the Phenomena-Noumena distinction, in a way, has to do with this famous metaphysical distinction between appearances and essence. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. But so before we get to that, I just want to kind of mention Hegel's initial complaint and kind of criticism about Kant's language. So one of the ways in which Kant describes the noumena is, right, he calls it a thing in itself, right? But Hegel, and this is in the Science of Logic, Hegel criticizes this. You know, he says, well, wait a minute, this is an abstraction. He calls this the term thing in itself an abstraction because he says that the word or the term thing in itself as a concept, it presupposes, according to Hegel, that the thing in question has no determination or has no relationship to anything else besides itself, right? So thing is in itself, and for Hegel, this means that it's not for any other thing, it's not related to any other thing, it's completely self-sufficient and isolated as a thing. And Hegel points out that by Kant's own admission, you know, Kant famously says that we can really say nothing about things in themselves because it is impossible for us to know anything about them. But this impossibility for Hegel just sort of amounts to the fact that the thing in itself is really nothing but just an empty term, an empty abstraction. But because it's such an empty abstraction, this creates a contradiction for Hegel, right? And the contradiction is that, or rather a problem, not really so much a contradiction, but of a bit, you know, a conceptual problem, which is that a thing can only be said to be in itself or self-sufficient in this way if it first negates any and all determination or relationship from everything that it isn't identical to, from anything that isn't itself. So the thing in itself, so the Kantian idea of a thing in itself for Hegel has a negative relation or can only subsist negatively by negating everything that's other to it. And this means for Hegel that things in themselves have negative reference or a negative relation to their other, right, to their appearance or their phenomenal form. And so this is important to keep in mind because it is it is this point that Hegel makes about negativity that forms the basis of his criticism of Hegel's distinction between phenomena and noumena. So the first point here is that Hegel complains that the thing in itself is an abstraction. It's kind of an empty statement. But one thing that Hegel does qualify about Kant is that the thing in itself, like I just said, for it to be really in itself, it has to negate everything that it's not. It has to kind of repel everything from it, conceptually speaking. So this means, like I just said, there's a sort of reference, negative reference going on here between the thing in itself and its appearance. So, and I will now just talk about the sort of readings, the chapter that I assigned, that maybe you've read, maybe you haven't read, that maybe made a bit of sense or maybe made no sense at all. But hopefully I can maybe explain a bit of it. So one thing that Hegel says is that, okay, so let's just take appearances, right? So if we think about phenomena, right, Kant's idea of phenomena or appearances, one thing we can say about phenomena, and I just sort of said this about the apples, is that phenomena are in a dynamic movement of flux and change, right? You know, things you have your favorite mug that you use to have coffee in the morning. Over time, that mug, you know, will have marks on it. It'll have coffee stains on it. The point is that the properties and the quality of things as appearances shift and change over time, right? And the point is that the essences of that thing have to remain fixed. Because if we want to ascribe any kind of, if we want to know anything about anything, we have to determine what is essential and what we have to know about it, right? So we can't really identify the coffee mug based on its initial appearance out of the box. Because if it changes over time, right? Say if you drop the coffee mug and it breaks and you have to glue a piece back together, suddenly your glued coffee mug is different in appearance than what it was before you dropped it. So the problem is that we can't just philosophically be satisfied with the fact that appearances undergo all this change and flux, right? So we have to, in a way, pause it, as Hegel says. We have to think about something that grounds the appearances, something that is stable within appearances, that isn't subject to change. And of course, this is the essence of things, or the things in themselves, right? So Hegel says, well, all right, fine. We can say we have appearances on the one hand, and we have as those appearances might exist in themselves beyond them being appearances. And Hegel says so if this is the case, then every individual thing that appears has to have a correlating thing in itself, right? A kind of correlating essence. But what this means is that the realm of things in themselves has to be as complicated and as nuanced as the phenomena in our experience, right? Because there's a one-to-one relation going on. So for Hegel, this means that the thing in itself, the world of the thing in itself, as he calls it, in a way has to be a self-sufficient totality. It has to be a world or a realm in which things in themselves are as distinct and differentiated as the appearances are distinct and differentiated, if you see what I mean. So we can, in a way, think about two different worlds, right? The world of appearances and the world of things in themselves. But Hegel points out, right, that for us to even have the ability to think of the concept of the world as a thing in itself, or the world of things in themselves, and he calls this the sort of supra-sensible world, right? The extra-sensible world, the world beyond our sense perception. For us to even think about this, we have to be able to distinguish, right, the world of things in themselves from the world of appearances, right? Because if they're identical, there's no way that we could distinguish them, if you see what I mean. So there must be some sort of difference going on, right? So they can't be completely identical in every way, because then there would be no way for us to even distinguish the world of things themselves from logically speaking, from the world of appearances. And so Hegel argues that since the supersensible world, or the world of things themselves, since that the world is the logical opposite of the world of appearances, in the sense that that is its differentiating characteristic, right? So if appearances are in flux and ever changing, then everything in the world of things in themselves are stable, right? Because if both worlds were in flux and changing, then the world of appearances would have nothing. Nothing would be grounding them as appearances, if you see what I mean. So logically, whatever the world of the thing itself is, we can sort of deduce from the fact that appearances have a variety to them. We can deduce, Hegel argues, that they are kind of stable and fixed. And what this logically then suggests for Hegel is that the world of things in themselves, how they relate to the world of appearances, is being the exact opposite of the appearance. So Hegel calls this the inverted world. So this is the term that he uses in the logic, and it's a term that comes up in the phenomenology. It's a very vexing term because it's not exactly clear how Hegel wants us to think about this term. But what he does say about this is that it means everything is the inverse of the appearances in the world of things in themselves, right? So what might appear to us to be white is the opposite in the world of things in themselves. It's black or something. What is hot here is cold there, and so on. So there's a relation of inversion for Hegel. And I'm not going to say too much about the inverted world, because, like I said, it is a bit ambiguous how Hegel actually intends us to think about this. He doesn't really explain it in great detail, but I'm trying to unpack his sort of logical argument here a little bit. Okay, so he says, look, the world of the things in themselves is the exact opposite of the world of the phenomena. So this means that everything in the so that means that we can kind of think about everything in the world as it is in itself as being the opposite of the world of appearances. That is the only differentiating characteristic, Hegel says, which means in nearly every other way, the two worlds are sort of identical, right? They're both totalities. They both contain a multiplicity or a kind of differentiated manifold, if you like, of things, right? So what we're sort of left with, and I'm just kind of summarizing Hegel's chapter here, what we're left with then is a conception of two worlds, right? Or two realms, however you want to think about it. The world of essences and the world of appearances, with identical form and content. And the only sort of difference between them is that they have an inverse relation, right? So what is black in one world is white in the other world, and so on and so forth. But what Hegel then shows at the end of the chapter is that if we kind of pause and think about really what it is we're trying to describe here, is that the identity of each world, or the identity of each thing in the world, and so for example, if you take the appearance of an apple in relation to its essence as a thing in itself, the relationship between these two things, the appearance and the noumena, or the thing in itself, the identity of each term for Hegel is only possible through their difference, right? So the identity of the appearance is only guaranteed as identity, if you like, if it's differentiated from not only every other appearance, but also differentiated from its own essence, if you like, or its thing in itself. But because each, and the converse is also true, that the thing in itself can only be a thing in itself if it is not a thing for us or a thing for a consciousness, right? That is, if it's not an appearance. But what this means for Hegel is that the identity of each thing in either world, if you like, is only guaranteed through their negative reference or relation to the other. And so suddenly what becomes really essential, because remember the problem here for Hegel is, where do we assign the essence? Is the essence the world in itself, or is it the phenomenal world? And how can we guarantee that? So the chapter ends with Hegel sort of arguing that really what is essential in all of this isn't one world over the other world, but their relationship is the essential component. The sort of negative relation that they have to one another. But because that is what is now presented to be essential, what this means is that we're not really talking about two separate worlds that exist in different realms or whatever it is. We are in fact thinking about one world, one totality. And the idea that you can divide or have a boundary between the world of phenomena and the world of thing in itself, at least for Hegel, it kind of collapses under its own contradictions, as it were. Because if you really think about what that may mean, it means that the thing in itself is only thinkable as a negative relationship to its phenomena. And similarly, the phenomena as phenomena is only thinkable and identifiable through a negative reference to its opposite in the thing in itself. So Hegel sort of concludes by saying, well, we're really describing one world as a totality, not two worlds. And what we're really talking about here is the relationship between appearances and essence, if you like, or appearances or things in themselves. But at this point, Hegel sort of says, well, look, we don't have to talk about things in themselves, because that's a self-defeating concept for Hegel. But what's more important is to really have a proper theory of how essence manifests, or how essences realize themselves in their appearances or as appearances. And he'll go on and appreciate, this isn't a course on Hegel, but he goes on to then theorize a more robust theory of manifestation in relation to essence. But what he does, in fact, but what this means for Hegel is that Kant's entire distinction is not only problematic, but it doesn't work, right? Because what Hegel tries to do, and I've just tried to summarize that chapter, but what Hegel tries to show us is that if we really think about what Kant is saying here, if we really think about this distinction, it doesn't really make any sense, right? In the sense that if Kant just if Kant is fine with leaving the thing in itself unconceptualized or unknown, as it were, Hegel sort of says, all right, well, let's take that at face value and see what we can say about it. And Hegel tries to show us that if we really think about the noumena, or if we really think about the thing in itself, it has more things in common with the phenomenal world than maybe Kant would like to admit. And not only that, the thing in itself is only conceptually comprehensible, let's say, through, like I said, a negative relationship to the phenomena. And what Kant is not able to appreciate, according to Hegel, is that this negative relationship affirms the fact that the thing in itself is not really a thing in itself, but it's a thing in itself with a negative relationship to its appearance, right? But for Hegel, this means that it's not really a thing in itself. It has a relationship to something else, but in a negative sense. And because Kant doesn't really have a proper theory of negativity, Kant isn't able to see how the thing in itself actually relates to or refers to appearances. And so Kant just leaves it where he leaves it. And what Hegel tries to do is he tries to show us that not only can we not divide up reality into things that we can know and things that we cannot know, but that having that division itself collapses, right? That we can actually talk about reality in a way that maybe Kant wouldn't like us to talk about. And not only that, that we can have knowledge of reality in a way that Kant wants to refuse. So Hegel, in a way, well, this doesn't mean that Hegel is some sort of weird empiricist or that he's not an idealist. It just means that, it just means that he thinks that the relation of the knowing subject to the world is in a way inescapable. Hegel agrees with Kant on that point. But he thinks Kant doesn't go far enough in theorizing about that relationship, right? Kant is happy to leave the division in place. And what Hegel tries to do is he tries to argue for why the division collapses if you examine the division close enough, right? I realize so I try to summarize Hegel's criticism, but what I would like to do now is, and I didn't take the full hour, which is fine for me personally, because it's a quick summary of the chapter. I'm happy to have more of a discussion now in case people have questions and comments, and we don't have to go the full 3 hours, so we can maybe end early if that's what is fine. That's really all I wanted to say about Hegel. There's a lot more I could say about Hegel, but that would require a lot more time. But I wanted to focus on Hegel's criticisms of Kant, and how he tries to show that Kant's own terms don't work. And I'm happy to have more of a relaxed discussion about that if we would like. So thank you very much. That's it for me in terms of the presentation. Okay, we're going to go to the first question. Is it Antoine?
Yeah.
Antoni? Sorry, I'm.
Thank you. It's
extremely
extremely interesting. I would like maybe to hear you to expand on the theory of negativity, and if you can maybe make it dynamics with how, because I was interested in hearing if there was actually a project by these philosophers to expand throughout the noumenal space. I feel as an artist that this is somehow how I can do art, is as to produce objects that show other people, other exploration into the noumenal or towards the noumenal. And so maybe could you expand maybe on the theory of negativity in this matter? Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing to clarify is that Hegel. So Hegel thinks the whole idea of a noumena realm is silly and kind of stupid, and it doesn't work, right? So Hegel rejects Kant's term, or the I tried to present this earlier. The idea of a thing in itself, Hegel thinks is kind of self-defeating, because the minute you're thinking about it, you're kind of determining it with your concepts, according to Hegel. So one thing I want to clarify is that Hegel rejects Kant's entire terminology. Now he tries to criticize Kant, and so the thing about negativity is that for Hegel, what he calls absolute negativity is the sort of movement of all of reality and all of thought. So it's I mean, you can so it's a logical concept, but calling it a logical concept for Hegel does not mean that it's something that only we have in our minds. He thinks it's a movement that is operative in the entire universe, right? He even tries to argue why God himself has a form of negativity, and this is why he likes Christianity for reasons that I can't get into today. So the point being is that Hegel fundamentally thinks that not only can we have knowledge of the world, right? He wants to go beyond Kant and say, yes, we can actually say something absolutely about the world and about reality. the reason Hegel thinks this is like I said, is that because he thinks the way that our minds are structured is identical to the way, although not reducible, but it's identical to the way that reality is structured. So for Hegel, both reality and mind have the same sort of rational conceptual structure, and he basically writes the phenomenology of spirit as a way to get ordinary people to make that realization. So the entire book, the Phenomenology, is devoted to people, to what he calls natural consciousness, to thinking through how that is the case. But yes, so Hegel doesn't really define negativity because he doesn't like the idea of defining concepts for philosophical reasons, right? But negativity is a process. It's a movement. It's like the engine of Hegel's system. So the minute you give a definition of it that is fixed, you kind of miss the point. That said, there are good resources that do explain where the term comes from and what Hegel means by the German term negativity, and so on and so forth. Yes, negativity also has to do with Hegel's term Aufhebung, which just means sublation, which is another term that he uses to describe this kind of movement. So he thinks because our minds work this way, or because we can think this way, and because reality is structured this way, then we can rationally know reality. For Hegel, this is sort of his point. Not only reality, all of history is sort of structured this way. And Hegel thinks, for example, that humanity, if you look at history, he says humanity has used art, religion, and philosophy to try to describe this one process. So he has a theory of aesthetics where he gives you a logically necessary account of art as a history and why art unfolded the way it did in Europe as a way of comprehending this process. But yes, we have more questions. So someone else had their hand up. Yes, Kazi, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, my original question you sort of answered it already, which was, does Hegel abandon the thing in itself? And it seems like your answer to Antoine's question is, yes, he does. So I guess my next question then is, how is new knowledge possible for Hegel if everything is sort of already subsumed in the way that the mind understands reality? If there's this identity between reality and the mind, at least for, it seems like the thing in itself, at the very least, creates a sort of, I guess, opening that allows novelty to arise, even if we can't actually grasp how that comes through. But if we reject the thing in itself, it seems like we foreclose the possibility of alterity, something that might exist, but not something that can be subsumed in terms of rational understanding. It seems like once we abandon the thing in itself, everything must be understood in terms of rationality. I might be misunderstanding it, but if you can clarify, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, this is a very again, people have been complaining about Hegel on this point since Hegel's own death, as it were. You know, everyone from Kierkegaard to Nietzsche to Derrida and Deleuze and Foucault and all the rest of them. And that's but one thing to say about that is that so Hegel does not argue, in fact, that everything can be known by virtue of this identity. What he does try to argue for, and what he does in fact say, is that because so Hegel's theory of identity isn't just to say that things are, you know, so if mind and the world are identical, then we can know the world. But that doesn't mean that there's no difference, right? So Hegel thinks that what he calls the absolute idea, right, is what unites the concepts that we have with kind of reality, as it were. Or you know, he tries to show that reality is sort of the manifestation of the same absolute idea, as he calls it. But this doesn't mean that you can reduce the world to our minds, or we can reduce the mind to the world, right? So Hegel is neither a reductive materialist or an empiricist, right? And he's not George Berkeley. I don't know if you've ever read Berkeley, who famously argued that everything was just ideas in our head, right? So Berkeley's a bit of a solipsist. So Hegel isn't, he doesn't want to restrict, because remember, if you restrict all of reality to the subject, we're back at Kant in a way, right? So Hegel doesn't want to, so he doesn't try to reduce the mind to reality or reality to mind, right? So one way to explain it would be, because you know, sometimes people say, oh, you know, is your theory, you know, do you have a mind independent theory of reality, right? Meaning, is your theory of reality something that is independent and divorced from the mind? Or do you have a mind dependent theory, meaning is your theory of the world something that is dependent upon the mind, upon the subject's mind? Hegel's position is neither of those two things. Hegel's position is that reality or nature, or whatever you want to call it, is mind-like. It is like the mind. Now, this doesn't mean that it's simply analogous, if by analogy we mean similar structure, different content. What it does mean is that reality and mind have the same content and same structure, but different forms of manifestation, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but oh, sorry, the thing about otherness. So, long story short, this doesn't mean that there's no room for new knowledge, right? It just means that because, like Kant, Hegel thinks, well, once you know something, you know it, right? So once we have a new knowledge of, I don't know, the universe, you know, if we discover some planet somewhere that has sentient life or sentient intelligent life, for example, great, we have a knowledge of that thing, fantastic. This doesn't mean that we can use Hegel to explain everything away, because he said in principle that might be the case, but of course, I mean, Hegel himself has limitations. For example, even though he knew about capitalism as a mode of production, Hegel didn't appreciate the internal contradictions of capital, and you needed Marx to come along and point that out using Hegel's own philosophy for the most part, right? So there are limitations to Hegel's system. And the idea that Hegel has this all-encompassing, absolutizing totality of a system is a bit of a caricature. And this doesn't mean that any new thing can be kind of slotted into his system. It's not that simple. I hope that made sense.
That definitely helped. Yeah, I guess like my last concern, you don't actually have to answer this, is that like perhaps there is novelty and difference that can arise within, I guess, something we call like Hegelian cognition, but it almost seems like perhaps even this difference is sort of delimited from the outset by the parameters of his form of reason. And so there might be novelty within those conditions, but they might be sort of ignored or non-recognized if there's a particular, I don't know, limited way that things are recognized. Hopefully that made sense, but thank you. That was actually very elucidating.
Well, I mean, one thing I will say really quickly is that the again, you hear this objection a lot against Hegel in different ways, but the point that always seems puzzling to me is what would a novelty or a I mean, you know, so if you take Deleuze, for example, Deleuze argues that Hegel subordinates difference to identity, right? That for Hegel, yes, he's a theory of difference, says Deleuze, but for Hegel, identity is Hegel privileges identity, and difference in itself isn't really appreciated, according to Deleuze, right? So that's Deleuze's criticism. But I mean, okay, maybe, but that would mean that even if Hegel does acknowledge differences, that they're always kind of reduced to an identity. And that's not exactly the case, I think. Because I think Hegel wants to, so like I said, he's not, so he wants to make room for new innovative things and difference. But Hegel's point is like, well, once we have a concept of something new, we know it. And pointing that out doesn't reduce its noveltiness or its difference, right? So I guess he himself, and I mean, because critics say, well, wait a minute, aren't you then just subsuming it into your system? And Hegel says, well, yeah, but that doesn't erase its difference, right? Like I said, people have been criticizing Hegel for this for years and years and years. So you either think it's a real problem or you don't. But anyway, if you have more questions, we're going to go to Erfan, I think. Go ahead.
Hey, Borna, thank you so much for your amazing talk. I just wrote my question here in the chat. So is concrete existence the essence of the object in Hegelian philosophy or not? That's the first question. And then what's the relation between the concrete existence and appearance? It's based on the text that we were supposed to read. And also I have another question. So the German idealism that comes after Kant, they all sort of tackle the idea of the thing in itself, but still they all stay correlationists, right? These are my questions.
Okay, right. Well, okay, yes. So your question about concrete existence. Well, right, yes. I mean, I appreciate that just giving you a chapter out of the logic without any context might be a bit weird. But so what Hegel means by concrete existence is the German word for it is Existenz. And I only point this out, not to sound pretentious, but I point this out because he differentiates between what he calls concrete existence and existence. So existence, the German word for that is Dasein. In some translations, it's translated as either as a determinate being, right? So that would be so that's one form of existence. But concrete existence is a fuller, richer concept. So concrete existence is something that has I'm trying to think. He refers to them as things that have solid grounds, right? Things that exist as facts, as it were. So for instance, objects of our experience, things in the world, cats, bicycles, airplanes, oxygen, things that have existence, things that exist concretely, as it were, not just abstractly, are what would qualify as being concrete existence. You know, our social political institutions, human beings in general, you know, animals, whatever it is, they exist in a more concrete way than something that may exist abstractly. For instance, so concepts have abstract existence in some cases because they're not as concrete as, say, cats, if you know what I mean. So it's just a term that he uses to give a fuller depiction of reality, right? So he makes distinctions between these different types of things that exist. I hope that makes sense. And your second question was,
is there any access to that concrete existence, or it's like noumenal?
No. So it's not noumenal. No. So it's definitely things that we can know and have experience of and access. Yeah, he abandons Kant's noumena because he thinks it's contradictory and strange and doesn't really do anything. And your second question was about correlationism. Well, if that's a reference to Mehra and the object-oriented people, that's a bigger question. If we take Mehra as an example, the correlation would be between thinking and being, right, or between thought and reality. And yes, in that sense, Hegel is a correlationist, but Hegel would argue that there's no way out of this correlation, that whenever you think, you're also positing or thinking about being. And every time we're thinking about being, you're thinking about thinking. So you can't divorce the two things. because Hegel thinks if you try to do this, you get caught in what is called a performative contradiction, right? So, which means that, you know, someone like 𝐁𝐸𝐤𝐤, who's a thinking subject, who's a philosopher, comes along and says, I'm going to just divorce this correlation and try to think about being without any reference to thought, or to the thinking subject. And Hegel's position is to point to 𝐁𝐸𝐤𝐤 as a thinking subject and say, well, you're still a thinking subject, so you're contradicting yourself and making that statement. So, you know, if you're not aware of that, you're running into problems. So that's sort of so Hegel, in a way, Hegel is in a way more postmodern than some of the postmodern philosophers, because he's very aware of the self-reference aspect of thought, or the self-reflective aspect of thought, right? So he's hyper vigilant about highlighting the fact that we are self-conscious thinking subjects. We all know that we can think, and we can think about the fact that we can know that we can think, right? So it's great. But the question would be, does correlationism, the question would be, is there a problem with this position, right? And people like Zizek and others have argued that you can read Hegel as a materialist, not just an idealist, because you can kind of dissolve the distinction between idealism and materialism. Okay, we'll go to the other question. Renzo, go ahead.
Yes, taking your last sentence about materialism, so made me think in very interesting aspect of Hegelian thinking today about the exteriorization of the mind. You know, that he take as externalism, what he call it objective spirit. In the sense to today in the technical mediums for knowledge, you know, that Stigler calling tertiary irritations or pretensions, how we externalize the knowledge by technical means. In the sense, how you can rescue this thinking of Hegelian about the exteriorization of knowledge of the mind today with the digital technology that we live today. You know? How you see that in this proletarization of the knowledge, taking this notion?
So I think I missed the main point of the question. You're talking about technology and the mind, was it? Sorry, can you just maybe rephrase your question for me?
Sure.
Thank you.
Of course. Taking this exteriorization that Hegelian thinking say about the exteriorization of the mind, knowledge, you know, the material aspect, how you taking this exteriorization as a materialization of the knowledge by technical side production today? You know? How we take the mind, the spirit, by my technical means, you know, that Bernard Stiegler taking as a tertiary rotation. You know? I don't know if you are, you know, Stiglerian thinking about the technical mediums of knowledge, tertiary rotations, and taking that humans are part of this organological aspect of technological for the noospheric aspect of knowledge in the human being. You know? We can be co-constitute by technological means for originate our own knowledge by these exteriorizations of this technical meaning. And say that this is a very clear aspect of pluralization of the knowledge. In which sense do you see rescue this thinking of Hegelian thinking in this time? And he don't solve this, of course, but how you can rescue this Hegelian thinking of exteriorization today with these technical means that we live in our knowledge for relational knowledge, more causal knowledge.
Right. Okay. So if I understand your question correctly, so are you sort of asking if the innovations in technology make Hegel obsolete? Is that sort of the idea?
How we rescue this thinking of exteriorization in Hegel today?
Right.
Technical mediums that we live today for knowledge.
Well, I mean, look, I suppose it depends where we draw, well, what technologies we're talking about and what kind of, I suppose, scientific or technological discoveries we want to think about. So I do know that, and I mean, it's a bit speculative on his part, but Zizek has written a lot about the link between quantum mechanics, right, and Hegelian speculative philosophy, for example. So Zizek thinks that that recent discoveries in quantum mechanics are in a way confirming his sort of reading of Hegel, his kind of ontological reading of Hegel. So on Zizek's view, the opposite is the case, which is that innovations in technology and science are in a way confirming claims that Hegel and I mean, maybe not Kant, but claims that Hegel may be made about the world and reality. Now, whether or not that is actually true, or whether or not that's convincing, that's up for debate. But in terms of technology, so for instance, if we could maybe say something like say something about the innovation of, say, artificial intelligence, right? The idea of the singularity, that we create an artificially intelligent robot or android or something that can replicate human consciousness. Isn't that then going to completely will this artificial intelligent being, will it be able to think the way Hegel claims that thought works? Not just human thought, but thought, universal thought, right? Which is what Hegel argues for. I think immediately the answer is in a way no, because because if it's true that, say, computer programming functions on it is predicated on kind of classical logic distinction, right? Identity, the law of identity, the law of excluded middle, the law of non-contradiction. Hegel's entire philosophy is a critique of classical logic, right? So if you're creating a computer or a artificial intelligent being, and you program that to kind of be able to machine learn, or whatever the phrase is, based on classical logic, then it's doubtful whether or not that artificial intelligent being will be able to think dialectically, if I can put it this way. At least that's what I'm speculating. I mean, who knows? Maybe I know there's this guy called Graham Priest in Australia, I think, who is kind of trying to argue for a fusion of artificial intelligence and dialectics. Also, Reza Negastari has written a book called Intelligence and Spirit, or something like this, and he argues for a link between Hegelian spirit and technological computational information. So people are trying it, which is interesting. But whether or not that makes Hegel himself obsolete, I don't know. Maybe, but I'm not in a position to say. I'm not very much versed in technological studies to be able to talk about it coherently. But okay, we're going to go to Alex, and then we'll go back to Anton.
Coincidentally, this is actually very related to the previous question, and probably will equally annoy you if you're not very well versed in these questions. But previously, you just formulated this sort of great simulation of Hegel responding to Meillassoux by pointing out that Meillassoux is himself a subject correlated to thought. And what immediately came to mind for me, and in the context of this residency, is that this is why sort of AI and blockchain technology as well should be an area of intense interest to speculative realist frameworks, I think, which is because they operate as these sort of desubjectified cognitive processes or post-cognitive intelligences. I think that may be a sort of way that they pose a problem to a Hegelian system.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they might. Again, I don't know, but even if you do, I mean, that's fine. Look, I personally, Hegel, like I said before, Hegel as a thinker has limitations, like with any thinker, right? And I think Marx is a very great historical example, right? That even though Hegel himself wrote about issues of labor, and Hegel knew and had read Adam Smith and wrote about capitalism, he was unable to see the contradictions within capital. And Hegel's entire philosophy is all about contradictions anyway. So, so his system does have limitations. So yes, we're going to go to Antoine. Go ahead, if you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think it has been kind of observed in the last two questions, but it was maybe more on the side of us as subject towards, let's say, an AI produce its own mind and also go beyond the mind that we use, so it can produce aesthetical objects from really another point of view, other of ourselves. I'm more asking the question of how it's going to be felt by us as a subject, so as like a non-resolved, really alien aesthetical object. And I was maybe my question will be, is that been taught? Is there observation or question on this subject?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I mean, maybe someone somewhere has kind of written about that topic. I don't know. Sorry, it's not a very full answer. I don't know everything, I swear to God. What's the time? Okay, I'm happy to take any more comments or questions, but are there any questions in the chat or anything? Let me see. I'm not sure. Okay, so Liz asked the question about noumena and boundaries. So Liz asks if the noumena are the boundary of the understanding, is the limit in Hegel the possibility of knowledge? Is a Hegelian limit aligned to negative theology? So the boundary limit referring to positive negative theology. Well, it depends what we mean here by limit. So if the question is about the limit of the phenomena in relation to the noumena, Hegel has to show where that limit isn't really a limit, or that there's no real distinction or kind of limitation in that way. And is it negative theology? Maybe, but again, if the idea of negative theology is that we can we can't say anything positively about God, as it were, then Hegel rejects that view. His whole philosophy is based around the idea that we can sort of philosophically know something about God. Not only that, but that God, like I said before, God himself, as it were, if he exists, functions and structures or is comprehensible by this kind of movement of absolute negativity. And this is why people hate Hegel, because if you take him literally in the statement, he is the philosopher who says that we finite mortal human beings can know the mind of God, which is a bit insane and bombastic if you are a theist, right? If you're an atheist, okay, whatever, God doesn't exist, so who cares? But Hegel himself was not really an atheist. He wasn't really a classical theist. So he made a very bold assertion. And again, these criticisms of, oh, look, Hegel thinks his system can know everything, even God's mind, are kind of couched in these statements that he makes here and there about knowing God. But he means something very specific, and he argues for it. So it's not like he just says it and doesn't go back to it. Any other comments or questions? Is there anything that I haven't said that people would like me to say or comment on? Yes, okay, we have a question. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I was just rereading the first page of Hegel. In the first sentence, paragraph deals with immediacy. And I've been thinking throughout this talk relating to essences, phases, like, can the S's contain information about the phase, state, or condition at the immediate moment in defining an object or defining a thing? And so I was just thinking about the inverted world and the tree falling. The tree is falling in one world. In the inverted world, the tree is being lifted. But however, the tree is only tree if the tree is standing. And then I like to make a correlation between governance, such as the king is only king if the king is ruling. And this sort of like, or the inverted king is the dethroned king. And my main point, I think, is that essence can only act as appearance because there has to be a processing, like a being, like a emotion. I didn't like to think that essence is a fixed or static condition, like the world is only in the things are only functional in their immediate operational state. And I just wanted to note that, I guess. I don't.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I mean, you yes, you sort of pointed out something that Hegel himself does eventually argue, which is that existence aren't really fixed, stable things, or rather they are stable and fixed, but that doesn't mean that they're not engaged in any kind of movement. So what he does eventually argue for, Hegel, is that there's no real distinction, as it were. Well, there is a distinction, yet that doesn't entail a absolute distinction, let's say, between essences and appearances, because he eventually does argue that essences appear, and that essences are nothing but their own self-manifestation, right? So he'll use this word manifestation to describe the appearance of essence. So this idea that we then have to look for a thing in itself, or we have to look for a hidden world of essences, Hegel thinks that's silly, and it's not the case. And in a weird way, materialists sort of say the same thing, but from the different perspective, right? They say, well, the material world is the only world that we have. We don't need to posit a realm of metaphysical substance behind matter, as it were. So Hegel is making the same point, but conceptually, right? Which is that, I mean, think about it this way. If you ask Hegel, is there a secret hidden key to all of reality? Hegel says, yes, there's a secret, and the secret is that there is no secret, right? The secret is that it's futile to try to look for some hidden reality that explains everything that we experience. What you get is what you get, and that is the truth there, right? So if a tree does fall in the forest, and so to the question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Like I said earlier, Hegel's reply to that is, that's a stupid question. Why would you ask something like this, right? Which is that, well, it's that question for Hegel is premised on confusion, right? Again, the confusion that we can maybe have knowledge of things outside of our experiences, or that there's a distinction between our experiences and things outside of our experiences, and that somehow then we have to kind of try to overcome that divide. And for Hegel, that's just nonsensical. But there is a, okay, I'm gonna go to the chat now. There's a question here, I think, by Jarek. So please explain something more about how appearances ground continuously one to the other. If appearances, well, right, because Hegel does say something like this, which is that appearances are sort of linked, and that's true. I mean, in the sense that, for example, if you have an experience of cause and effect, so if you, the classical human example of, you know, if you see someone playing billiards or pool and one ball hits the other ball, you know, you say, well, one thing caused one thing to move, right? So you have, in that way, you have kind of experiences of how appearances relate to one another and how they affect one another. And Hegel's sort of point with this is that this is true, but this, again, this doesn't mean that we're just thinking about appearances, because the essences are nothing but their appearance. And I think there's a question in, okay, yeah, Darren has a question here. Can the past of a thing, I assume that's a temporal past, can the temporal past of a thing be a noumenal aspect of what it appears to be at any given moment that we perceive it? Okay, well, I mean, this is similar to the idea of you know, the previous question about the stars and the cosmos, right? I mean, maybe, but again, why call this? Because remember, why call this noumenal? Because the noumenal presupposes that it's a thing in itself that does appear to us, right? So if you're going to temporalize the noumenal, why not just call it the unknowable, or the thing that we don't have a knowledge of yet, right? If you're going to temporalize it. And I think if you do that, Hegel has no problem with it, right? So to go back to 𝐁𝐨𝐫𝐧𝐢𝐤's point about otherness in Hegel and whether or not Hegel actually allows for otherness, one version of this criticism that people put is about alien minds, right? About minds that aren't like ours. Does Hegel have a theory about alien minds? Or is Hegel able to allow for non-human minds, or minds that aren't like the ones that he's describing? And in a way, I think he does. But remember, the point is that it goes back to the self-reflexive point, or the self-reference point of the subject, right? Insofar as we are thinking subjects that are reflecting and thinking about the world, we can't really escape that fact, right? We are self-conscious beings. We have awareness of ourselves as self-conscious beings. So when we posit, you know, thought experiments like alien minds, Hegel would ask this person, number one, how do you know it's alien? That is, how do you know that is other to you? Because if you're going to describe the thing as other, that it presupposes that you can differentiate it from yourself, right? And what we just said about negative relation, that assumes a sort of, it entails a relationality for Hegel. So that's the first thing. And the second thing Hegel would maybe ask, you know, the person is, well, how do we know that the alien mind is a mind at all? I mean, you don't have to think about alien minds. I mean, Hegel agrees with Aristotle that human beings think and animals don't. So Hegel has this very kind of anthropomorphic view of thought. Now, modern science, of course, dispels that view, because with modern science, we can prove that a lot of animals think, it's not just humans, right? So does this dispel Hegel's entire philosophy? Well, no, not really. It just means Hegel was a bit wrong about his classical definition of thought. It doesn't invalidate Hegel's entire system, right? But again, does this mean that animals can think dialectically? Well, I mean, I don't know, right? Like, can I teach my cat to read the science of logic? Probably not. She doesn't have patience for books, and she's a cat, so she doesn't care about reading, right? But the point there being that the point being that the idea of otherness is something that I think it's a complicated point, but I think Hegel does allow for it, but not in the way that people seem to want him to, which is to think about otherness without using the resources of your own thought to think about otherness, right? So whenever people bring up the issue of otherness or of difference to Hegel, from a Hegelian perspective, it seems like they're asking Hegel to allow for otherness to subsist within a system without conceptually accounting for that otherness, which is just self-defeating from a Hegelian perspective, right? Because it goes back to the point about self-reference and the self-conscious subject thinking, doing the thinking. So it gets a bit complicated in that respect. I'm wary of the time. I know we have about 10 minutes, so I took up the full 3 hours talking about this stuff. Is there any pressing question or anything that you really want me to address? And I'm happy to do that. If not, I'm more than happy to sort of end things here, if that's okay. Sorry, so just Darren has a comment about the point I just made. So he says the relation between different things that are related by their non-relation is not the same as the relation between things that are related. Okay, well, let's take that apart. So the relation between different things that are related by the non-relation. Yeah, that is different than how they're related by their actual relation. And Hegel's solution isn't really thin, I think. Hegel accounts for this because the way things non-relate to each other is through their negative reference, right? Negative relation, right? So for instance, I'm trying to think of an example. So yes, it is different. So making a claim of identity, if I say A is related to B in a positive way, that is different than saying that A negates B, that A is different from B, and that by virtue of this difference, A is nevertheless related to B, right? So Hegel's point about negativity is that when you differentiate something from something else, you are nevertheless inscribing a relationship there. So if A is different from B, and we can describe what this difference is, and we can give a character to it and explain it, that still entails for Hegel a certain relationship. So it's not exactly a non-relation. It's more accurate to call it a non-identity relation, if you like. So because we're saying A is not identical to B, they're different, there's still a relationship there. That's different than saying that A and B are identical and therefore related, right? So Hegel's point about negativity is just to highlight that fact, is that difference, for him, difference entails a kind of relationship. But this doesn't mean that, so if two things are different and if they're related by their difference because they're different, this doesn't mean that they're identical. It means that they're different. So it doesn't reduce difference to identity in the way that some people claim. Right? So highlighting their negative relation to one another does not erase their difference. Or at least Hegel himself thinks that's not the case. Now you might think, well, he was wrong, and what he's really saying is that he's affirming a strong theory of identity. But he himself thought that we can have a notion of negative reference without canceling or annulling differentiation. All right, well, I'm going to end it there, I think. Thank you very much for listening and participating. It was a pleasure. I hope it wasn't too boring. And thank you for hanging out with me on a Saturday evening here in London. So